I'm an engineer by background and training. Um, I've been, I guess, working for 30 odd years in the industry. And what I'm going to do today is just take you through kind of 4 ages of my career. And with each age, give you just a few sort of lessons, things that I've learned. It is slightly self-indulgent, so forgive me for that. But I'm going to end up on social value and end up talking to you about a place that I never ever thought I'd be at as an engineer when I kicked off my career. So it is a bit of a journey. Just sort of the background, the 4 ages, brief overview. I started out at University of Bath. I'm going to talk you then through just what I quickly did at Arups. Battle McCarthy was my own practice that I set up and ran with a structural engineer, Chris McCarthy. Then I moved into the corporate world, Deloitte. And then finally, I'm here at the Social Value Portal now. So student, engineer, corporate consultant, social entrepreneur. That's what I've been called anyway, so it's nice to be there. First off, University of Bath. For those who didn't know it, so my contemporaries were people like Patrick Bellew, and we had all sorts of interesting tutors. But the particular focus at Bath University was an integrated course. Architects and engineers were working together. First 3 years, there was actually no difference between the engineers and architects. The 4th year, we kind of specialised and we came together with a big project. So it was a very sort of integrated course. And I learnt a lot through that particular process. Specifically, looking back now, I learned about communication and language. And there's one thing that I think that is very important, that if you're going to produce a good building, a good master plan, then you need to be able to communicate with everyone on that design team. But it kind of set the standards for my particular approach to design, which was all around understanding comfort, so understanding people, responding to climate, materials response, lessons from nature, and then bioclimatic traditions. So those all sort of came together, and I kind of formed my toolkit that ultimately I used in my practice. Just a couple of really interesting lessons that inspired me along the way. There's one tutor there called Martin Wilkinson. He used to talk about rabbits quite a lot. He was the lighting engineer. He spoke about rabbits in 3 boxes, rabbits in a green box, a blue box, and a red box. And he spoke about how they responded, pairs of rabbits. And in a green box, they kind of just normal rabbits responded, just normal set of offspring. Blue box, actually, the number of offspring went down. The red box, though, the number of offspring went up. Now, that's kind of interesting. I found that fascinating, 21, 22-year-old being told that colour can impact. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we are rabbits in our coops here, but I am suggesting that one of the lessons I learnt there was that engineering was much more than just, temperature, plus or minus, much more than lux. Actually, it was about, the psychology of a space, as well as the physiological of a space. And this kind of brought it home to roost. So this is a slide that a particular lecturer called Derek Kroom now, who's an esteemed kind of professor and all sorts of things. Anyway, there's this famous person called Fanger. Now, Fanger is the comfort guru in my world, was my world anyway. And he felt that we needed a measure of smelliness. And he came up with this thing called the OLF, O-L-F-F. And he had to then work out, how do you work out what is 1 OLF, what's 2 OLF, what's 2.5 OLF. And he got these guys, basically, this is part of the experiment. So these guys to run, all running at different times, different sort of metabolic rates. And the women were there. They were professional sniffers out of the cosmetic industry. They had to smell and kind of put a scale together. And he tried very hard to make this work. It didn't work. So it just tells you that at some point, you can't. This comfort is subjective as well as being objective. You can't just expect it all to work. And this, for me, was what really blew my whole understanding about building. So this is a classic graph that has been around for 20, 30 years. But basically, it shows you along the bottom, outside air temperature, along the y-axis, comfort temperature. And what's really important about this is that the buildings, where there is a sealed skin, this is a sealed skin building, and this is a naturally ventilated building. And what's really important about that, it shows that when people know that the the skin is openable, they're willing to put up with higher temperatures. So they are more comfortable if in summer with warmer temperatures inside. And that is really important because it talks about the psychology of it. So, these are some lessons that I learned early on in the process. I then moved to Overup, where I stayed for sort of 7 years or so, worked with architects like Will Alsop and Rogers, started to work with Foster a little bit, and the Big Blue in Marseille, the headquarters, GSV headquarters. This is a double skin building. Anyway, began to sort of just learn my trade, if you like, as an engineer. And then following that, in 1993, just after the Earth Summit set up Battle McCarthy. And this was really sort of where I started getting the sense of what I was all about as an engineer. And the word for me was sustainability. That was what I just latched onto. And this is back in 93 we set up. So 92 was the Earth Summit. And it was like, this is it. This is my kind of, moment of vision, of clarity. And everything about my life is going to be about sustainability. And in that process, and I'll show you in a moment, we totally nailed all the environmental stuff to do with sustainability. And it was great. So, and I'll show you in a bit. But, we spoke all the good words, social, environmental, economic. It was all about triple bottom line. You guys know all about that. And we did some amazing buildings, and the background was things like G8 summits. It was, Greenpeace doing all this. So it was agitation. And we were a young team agitating. So I was kind of 30 and I was really agitating for change, and I wasn't going to accept any of this sort of standard stuff. And we left Arabs because Arabs didn't get it. They didn't get sustainability. They didn't want to know about it. And so we stopped doing it. Now look at it. It's like you can't move for the bloody word, can you? It's everywhere. And this sort of stuff here was what was driving us. So the fact that water was almost 4 times, 5 times more expensive than petrol, the equivalent amount of water, hasn't really changed much, has it? But nonetheless. And then, the fact that the energy costs, here are the energy costs of a typical building. So this is running a building. It's all about salaries. It's got nothing to do with energy. And so we then said, look, this is about people. At least we thought it was about people. You've got to think about productivity, and it's not just about saving energy. And so the architecture started to emerge. And so remember, we used those principles: climate, comfort, materials. It was all about manipulating those. And so whilst we were not the architects, our principles and method was always the same. Understand climate, work out what people want, respond with materials, shape and form. And the architects that chose to work with us decided an architecture emerged that was kind of an environmental expressionism, you could call it. Peter Rice, you could say, and Lloyd's and those sorts of things. It's structural expressionism, Pompidou. We developed, or were part of that movement called environmental expressionism, I guess. So this is Ionica headquarters, wind towers. It's the dominant architectural feature. You can see how this all works. Nat vent, central atrium, daylit, it's all standard stuff. I mean, hopefully you've learned about this stuff in college now. This was a building we did with Field and Clegg and Bradley. Again, naturally ventilated, low embodied carbon materials. The wind towers were slightly different because it was a kind of ridge across the top there. But, it was designed around people. It was designed around environmental issues. What was interesting about this building, it was off-grid when it comes to water and waste. And so we had on-site reed beds, on-site aquifer providing all the water. And it was really quite an innovative building at the time, built in 97, 98, I guess, that sort of time. And moving on, designed this with Combe, Peds and Fox, much more corporate type building, a big 32,000 square metre headquarters for a company called Endesa out in Spain. And again, nat vent, it was daylit, but we had this enormous PV roof. I think it was like 6,000 square metres of photovoltaics on the roof that produced part of the power of the building. But we also buried these 2-metre diameter earth tubes, 6 of them, underneath the atrium, used the wind towers at the top to draw the air through, and so that provided all the cooling. So, really it was quite an interesting period because the architects was very much dominated, not dominated, but you could tell it was an environmentally led architecture. This is the atrium space. You can see the PVs on top, and these are some of the wind towers. And the wind towers have progressed slightly from the Ionica ones because they sort of have sun coming in, so they're also driven by hot air. So a kind of interesting phase, and that sort of towards the back end of my work there, we started thinking about buildings as pieces of infrastructure. So rather than just being a building, it was a piece of infrastructure that contributed to society, and it should be an energy producer, it should be a water producer, it should be a waste eater, these sorts of things. And there are plenty of examples, the sort of water mills and windmills. These were sort of things. So we started thinking about this. And this kind of culminated in more or less my last building, where I lost faith to some extent, in the design of the Freedom Tower. So we were asked just after the towers came down. The towers came down in September. We started work on the replacement tower in kind of October, November of that year. To come up with a new design. And it was driven by a chap called Silverstein. Really interesting design, and the process was all about sort of, getting the building an iconic. And we went all out environmentally. We had, it was low energy. We had 50 wind turbines designed into the top of the building. You see the top of the building there? We had 50 wind turbines producing, the vast majority of the power. We got kind of, I think, carried away with ourselves, to be honest with you, and forgot, I think, to some extent what it was all about. It didn't ever get built, this particular version of the building. And, I think there's probably a lesson there, because I met corporate America, and corporate America was very different from the architecture of Europe, totally and utterly different. And they saw buildings as a product. But nonetheless, through this sort of process, all sorts of lessons are learned. The first lesson as an engineer, I think, that was really important to me is that good design requires sort of good collaboration. If you're not talking properly with your engineers, your quantity surveyors, all these different individuals within the design team from the earliest phase, I don't think you're going to produce the best type of architecture. Now, that's really difficult, because if you're a conductor and you're conducting or part of a sextet, just six, that's one thing. But if you're a conductor, which I kind of see as the architect is, and you've got 100-piece orchestra, it's much, much harder. But you will fail unless you learn the language, unless you learn about these individuals. The buildings will not be as good, and you won't achieve what you're trying to achieve. So collaboration, for me, is right at the top of the agenda. And it's kind of interesting. I think that, for me, leadership in architecture now is, yes, you've got to be up there taking the lead, but actually you've also got to know and recognise when someone else around the design team has a better idea than you, because it is not just about you, okay? Those buildings that I showed you succeeded because the architects recognised that the environmental engineering had as much contribution to make as the architectural piece, and they used that as the inspiration. So I think that's really important. Whilst you are, supposedly the leaders in the design team, you're not. You need to think about how you bring others through and share the leadership, because then you will get much, much better design. And you also get shared ownership. That's fundamental. The other thing I learned through that process is that ultimately it's about people, about productivity. The energy thing was kind of, we got lost in it. It was a bit of a waste of time, to be honest with you. And all the environmental stuff, as I said, we kind of nailed it, but I don't think we didn't succeed really from a building perspective, from a community perspective. The other thing I learned was that change takes a long time. I mean, that my career there was 16, 17 years with Battle McCarthy, in fact, 25 years, including Arabs, and change, it's about belief and it's about time, and it's quite hard to maintain belief for a long time. But it does need that. And the thing about building cycles is that, it is a 3 or 4 year cycle. You don't churn buildings through every 6 months, from conception through to completion. It is 3 or 4 years. So you've got to maintain that vision. You've got to maintain that energy. And if you believe that you are, to quote a word, change makers, then you've got to understand you're in it for the long term. This is not going to happen overnight. But if you maintain your view, your vision, then you'll deliver. But it is about those two things working together. And maintaining the belief. I then jumped out of Battle McCarthy and became a corporate person. Look at the change of slides. So this is a corporate slide from Deloitte. It was like, wow, I really shifted my career. But I followed sustainability. And what happened is that Deloitte wanted set up a carbon team. And so I went in, carbon and property team. So I went in to set up a carbon and property team. And ended up selling three things: assurance services, so that's audit services. So I would go in and check corporate responsibility reports. And I'd check that the numbers being reported were correct. It was like really, really important, but God, it was boring stuff. We did corporate advisory services. It was really quite interesting, actually, and that was more about, how does a business become responsible? What does it mean to be a good citizen from a business perspective? And then also sustainable property services that kind of ran through. Now, what was really interesting about my time at Deloitte, certainly when I sort of first went there, it kind of felt like bursting through the clouds, a low cloud cover. I got there. I mean, who's heard of Deloitte? Has everyone heard of Deloitte? Has some of you not heard of Deloitte? You can be honest. That's amazing. When I joined Deloitte 6 months before, I had never heard of Deloitte. I really hadn't. They're accountants, aren't they? And then they wanted me to get involved. What on earth do you want to employ me for? You're an accountant, aren't you? But of course, they saw this as a softer side of a big corporate animal. And I was there to try and help it go through. Anyway, we plugged all that, but what was really interesting from a corporate perspective, where we started talking to companies like Unilever, Nike, and also sort of Publicis who produce clothing in France. And it was all about how you do business. And sustainability was actually not about the buildings at all, and that's what surprised me. It was all about the stuff that was made. It was about the people. It was about sort of the organisation itself. And so issues that we were tackling, like why doesn't a consumer buy green stuff? 65% of consumers go into a store saying they're going to buy green stuff. Only 20% come out having followed through with that sort of their value. That's called the value action gap. So I found out. So these are really interesting things. And the bottom line is, this is the sort of thing they're dealing with every day of the week. I mean, I won't go through all this, but buildings don't appear on this. And it was kind of a bit of a shock, I have to admit, to realise that buildings to corporates are not the most important thing. Once they're built, it goes onto their balance sheet as a capital asset, and then it's all about turnover. And it's all about what they're doing in business, So there's some interesting lessons to be learned there. So finance, the two things I took away from it: finance transformed for sustainability and social impact in investing. And some of those lessons that I learned there were sort of buildings are less important than the corporate culture. Corporates view buildings through a different lens. And you kind of get into that lens to understand it. Environmental issues are important, but actually well-being of their people trumps everything. They actually don't care about ultimately how the building looks, from the outside at least. Architecturally, the iconic building is important to some, but very few. They're much more focused on what's happening in the building. And ultimately, there needs to be a business case for everything. So moving on, last 10 minutes, I'm going over by 3, okay, so forgive me for that. I started out, when I left in 2013-14, the first thing I did was bump into someone called Hazel Blears, an MP. And Hazel Blears had launched the Social Value Act a year before. And the one thing I hadn't ever achieved at Battle McCarthy or Deloitte is cracked the social bit of sustainability. What on earth, how do you measure it? What is it all about? I'd always spoken about it, but I hadn't really cracked it. And the Social Value Act came out, and it actually requires an organisation to measure their social impact. It could be called a Sustainability Act. It is the most amazing piece of legislation that I doubt many of you have heard about it in this room, unless you're working with public sector. But those of you who haven't, it's worth checking it out, because it is a triple bottom line piece of legislation. So we did a review about it, and out of that developed a sort of approach around measurement. And I think that, for me, this is kind of where it's all taking me, which is sort of, ultimately, how do buildings, how do architects, how do we all contribute to society? But understanding what society looks like. And society is made up of 4 pillars: local government, third sector, community, business. You lose one pillar, and we're okay. We're okay. Lose 2 pillars, and actually things start to rock. We are no longer stable. And that, for me, is very important. So, as designers, we need to understand that, we are about those 4 pillars. Now, we're building buildings, but actually we are also business. This is us here. You create these things here. Okay, there might not be so much happening in those spaces, but actually you're contributing to those areas quite considerably. So we need to understand that we are a part of a broader societal sort of perspective. And I think that this goes to the core of what social value is all about. So traditionally, you might say there's certain number of jobs, and that's kind of interesting. But actually, the question you need to be asking is, who is getting that job, and what is the value to society of that individual getting that job? So on the one hand, you've got someone from a good family. On the other hand, you've got someone from a troubled family. And actually, society puts a value on that. That's worth £2,200, roughly. And that's worth around £22,000. And the reason is that that individual is now not committing crime, is not taking benefits, is now contributing positively to society. Now, the question and the challenge I've got for you guys is how, through what you are doing, your buildings, your design, your procurement, are you helping those sides, both sides of that equation? What are you doing beyond just building a great building and designing great spaces? How can you take it beyond? Really what you need to think about, and this is how we go about our work, is measuring social value. We look at the themes, and in particular, we focus on the social outcomes. And so one thing you should be doing around, as you're doing design, of course, you're thinking about connectivity and number of people and the total area and cutting the plant space down and all that sort of rubbish. But actually, you should be thinking about the outcomes. Make your designs outcome-focused. Kind of answering the question why, and I know that came up before. If you can make it outcome-focused, and if those outcomes can match the needs of the local authority area, and you've been through a process of consultation with the communities, then actually you're going to get a much stronger development that can ultimately become a community asset for you. So this is a measurement. We did a social value measurement for Legal and General in a building in Hammersmith. And we asked the question, what's the social value of this office block? And you think, well, what can an office block do? Well, it's got an external space, but what can it do beyond that? Well, actually a lot, as it happens. We broke it down into 3 stages: materials, manufacture, where the materials come from, construction, and then occupation. And we developed that metrics and measures that I showed you just moments ago. And we put together a sort of a measurement strategy around this, asking questions of the contractor, the occupiers, and everyone through the process. And the results were really interesting and actually quite fascinating, for me at least. And we compared everything to Section 106, which is a £1 million contribution. This is business as usual. Social value, this is just through construction process. Social value 0.6 million. But the stretch target, if there was a real focus on where things are being built, bought from and how they're being built, you could add an additional £7 million. So the total social value on hand was 8 million. But the only thing that's being taken at the moment is 0.6 million. So that represents the lost opportunity just during construction and materials. And when you begin to think about a 7-year lease period, and you ask the question, what is the tenant doing? How is the tenant contributing to the community? Then actually the numbers go kind of skyrocket. And you end up with a business as usual, 56 million over 7 years, the stretch being 134, and the total being 135, including Section 106. So the lost opportunity being of the order of £76 million worth of value. That's £10 million a year of social value. Now, I could go through how we've measured that in detail, but that's the challenge that I want to put to you is if you can begin to think about those measurements and think about how you put a value on it and think about the outcomes, then actually might lead you to a different approach to design, might lead you to a different architecture. So important thing to take away from the case study is that social value add can be generated at every life stage of the life cycle. And I know you don't have much control over the tenants, but actually could you? And actually you are also all tenants of buildings, so you do. The occupiers do make the largest contribution, but that's why you need to focus on it. And the other part of that is that Section 106 is dwarfed. Actually is very small compared to the total social value that comes out of the construction process and everywhere else. So the challenge that we're putting to planners at the moment is why are you negotiating around Section 106 when you should be negotiating around social outcomes? And actually that's something that you can get control over. So I'm going to go to the workbook. So I'm sorry for that last bit, it was somewhat rushed. But just to rehearse that journey again. So, I started off design, collaboration. That was a really important part of what I did. I then put all my environmental learning into practice. And I think I cracked it, the environmental bit. You might disagree, but, there's some great pieces of architecture out there that are environmentally led. And I can look at them and say, that's my wind tower sort of stuff. Now, you could argue, well, environmental stuff shouldn't ever be part of the architecture. You shouldn't see it. Fine, okay. But actually, we did crack it. And as an industry, we've kind of cracked the environmental thing. I'm now trying to move on to the social thing, and I've always spoken about it, but I've never, ever been able to put any numbers to it, or never been able to even understand the scale of the contribution. And just to step back to that building, so the total construction cost is 90-odd million pounds. Over 7 years, the total social value, as you saw, was 150 million pounds. The Section 106 was only 1 million pounds. So the social value is enormous, okay, is massive. And I think the challenge that I want to put to you is to begin to think above and beyond just the design. I know you've had conversations earlier today about community consultation. That's really important. That's about a needs assessment. Can you put a value to it? And if you're actually consulting and put a value to it, are you putting priorities to it? Will it change how you design? Will it change your outcomes? Will it change what the practice is doing as a whole? So first challenge is how will you measure the value that development brings to both the physical and the spirit of the community? The two are equally as important because buildings are there not because they're great pieces of stuff. Actually, they're there for communities. And if they don't look after the community, they've kind of failed. How will you effectively engage with local stakeholders to better understand the nature of what is important to them so you can feed the social value elements? How could you develop an approach to design and occupation that focused on shared outcomes and long-term community prospects and impacts? So it's that whole shared outcome piece for me, which is very important. Does your involvement stop with the final sign-off of the snagging list, or can you find a reason to stay engaged, going beyond it? And then remember that you are all tenants as well, so you can contribute and you are part of the community.